Stone Age. General Musharraf in his book is very funny about this. General Musharraf's book is actually a book worth reading. He has the coolest opening chapter of any book I've ever read, any biography I've ever read. He just reminisces about the different attempts on his life for like 30 pages, which is. So he's like a tough guy. He's a tough guy. He's not the guy who normally caves. But he caved instantly on this because he understood that Richard Armitage, who isn't a tough guy, meant it. Same thing with the Russians. The Americans decided they needed certain old Soviet bases in Central Asia. Very politically difficult for the Russians, which still looks on Uzbekistan, Tajikistan as their turf. But the Russians caved in because they knew America was serious. What's the difference? It's not that we had the Maxim gun. It's that very unusually, and almost freakishly, after 10 years of kind of being mired in multilateral passivity, America suddenly, General Musharraf and Moscow realized that America was serious about using the Maxim gun in its national interest. Well, 5 years on, that's all changed. Bashar Assad is a weak enemy. He's been getting away with murder on a huge scale in Iraq, and yet he doesn't have to worry about sleepless nights in his palace in Damascus. He had a few in the spring of 2003. He's not having them now. So that, as I said, is the pompous answer to why I wrote the book. I really want to change the terms in which we think of the war on terror as part of a global struggle in which we are starting and playing on the worst turf. We're playing on turf that causes us, that requires us to end our assumptions about, for example, population growth, to end our assumptions about multiculturalism, to end our assumption on a range of things that are forced down the throats of our children in every kindergarten across the Western world. That's a huge thing. And no matter how many guns and nuclear weapons we have, it's not going to make any difference unless we win on that turf too. And the less pompous answer to why I wrote the book is because I object to what I think of as the Larry King school of foreign policy. I hasten to add, I'm not thinking of Larry when he says, tonight, Anne Margaret for the full hour. Tonight, Dick Van Dyke for the full hour. Carol Channing for the full hour. I love that side of Larry King. The problem is on nights like tonight, when the president is giving an address, and afterwards it's usually followed by Larry with a panel of 6 senators and ex-secretaries of state discussing the speech. And the difficulty is that they're exactly like his stroll down memory lane with Dick Van Dyke and Carol Channing. It's distinguished old people reminiscing about other distinguished old people. On his political panels, Larry interviews great men about what needs to be done, and the great men all agree that what needs to be done is that the president needs to get other great men involved to, quote, broker a deal. I remember seeing one around the time of the Israel-Hezbollah thing, and Senator Chuck Hagel said that the answer to this Israel-Hezbollah war was that Bush needed to appoint Colin Powell or Jim Baker as his special envoy. And then Senator Barbara Boxer comes on and said, no, that's not what's needed. Bush needs to appoint Madeleine Albright as his even more special envoy. And then former Senator George Mitchell, who always seems to be an envoy somewhere or other around the world. You can take a vacation and you'll turn up in Latvia or Chad, and George Mitchell will be there as a special envoy sorting out what's ever going on around there. They've been doing it for decades. Nothing seems to happen, but it doesn't seem his envoy career is a model. He's probably teaching a course in how to be a special envoy at Harvard. He said that it wasn't enough just to appoint Madeleine Albright. Bush needed to meet with the leaders of the European Union because, of course, they have such great influence at advancing American foreign policy goals in the Middle East. And then someone else proposed an emergency meeting of the G8. And all this is complete nonsense because if those guys really believe that, we are in deep trouble. The most important feature of the world today is not the great men. You learn nothing about Jordan by flying in and meeting with King Abdullah, because King Abdullah does not speak for the people of Jordan. And you know nothing about Saudi Arabia by going in and receiving assurances from their King Abdullah. And you learn nothing about Egypt from going in, flying into Cairo and speaking to President Mubarak. They do not speak for their peoples. And it's the non-entities who make the difference. The guys who can never in their life get on a Larry King panel, they are the ones who make the difference in the world today. These millions and millions of Muslim young men being pumped out in lands with no economic opportunity, no education. The most salient fact about the Palestinian question is this, that the mean age in the Gaza Strip is 15.8 years. Now, you look like a prosperous crowd. I'm sure you all live in nice neighborhoods with low crime. You may live, like me, I live in a picture-perfect New England small town. Looks great on postcards. But even if you live in beautiful parts of the world with no crime, you know that the little crime there is in your part of the world is generally caused, if somebody steals some beers from the convenience store, it's caused by fellas in their late teens, early 20s. If you preside over a nation, or even a pseudo-nation like Palestine, of teenage boys, what sense are you going to get out of them? You can't send Jim Baker in to a population of 15-year-old punks, because they don't look at the world the way Jim Baker does. And I think that is the real problem, that if you don't address the demography here, you don't really understand what's going on. You know, those guys from Yemen and Pakistan and Gaza, they're moving to Western nations. They're moving to European nations. And my book is really the antidote, I think, to Larry King panels. I think it understands that those anonymous people, those millions and millions of anonymous young men, guys raised in a death cult, guys raised at Pakistani madrasas, going to Europe and discovering that although they live there, and again, this is where the economic argument, I think, is insufficient. Economists, when the guy from the Pakistani madrasa lands at the airport, they think, well, he's coming here to do the jobs Americans won't do. They see him as the convenience store clerk. They see him as a plumber. He doesn't see himself as that. He's being a plumber to advance his other interests. And the reality is that a significant proportion of those people, their pan-Islamist identity is their core identity. It spreads across borders with ease, and it has a greater pull on them than the passports they carry in their pockets. They think of themselves as Islamic rather than as Belgian or as Dutch or as Canadian. And I'll just close with what I think is the most important fact in my book. It's right there up at the front, but I don't think the Jim Baker crowd thinks about this. In 1970, the developed world represented just under 30% of the global population, and the Muslim world 15%. By 2000, the developed world's share of the global population had fallen to just over 20%, and the Muslim world had increased to 20%. In other words, in 1970, the developed nations had twice a bigger share of the global population as the Muslim world, 30% to 15%. By 2000, they were at parity, each at 20%. And that's why whenever you hear any of these so-called foreign policy realists talk about stability, you should hoot and jeer, because there's no such thing as stability, only the illusion of stability, like the Connecticut River in my part of the world when it ices over this time of year. Underneath the ice, the water's still moving. The unreal realpolitik crowd think that you can ring-fence a problem, you can contain it. But under the veneer of containment, history is still on the march. And if it's not moving in your direction, then chances are it's going in the other fellas. It's moving very fast right now and not in our direction. 1970 doesn't seem terribly long ago. In fact, if you look at the Larry King guest list, it would seem like 1970. It's Anne Margaret, Dick Van Dyke, Jimmy Carter, James Baker, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Tina Louise. They're all there. It's unchanged. But in fact, the world has completely altered. And if you look at those statistics and then nudge it on a bit, what will those numbers look like in 2020, 2030? We won't even be able to do them. We won't even be able to say, well, the developed world's fallen to 12%, the Muslim world's population has increased to 28%, because by 2030, much of what we think of as the developed world will be part of the Muslim world. And that is why it behoves America, which has stronger advantages,